And the oracle at Delphi answered, "There is no man wiser than Socrates." Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in the history of philosophy, especially the great classics. From each I've selected an excerpt, no more than 1 hour. Our purpose is to do a close reading of an important work with the accompanying text. In this episode, we are turning to Plato's Apology, the great philosopher's reconstruction of the trial of another great philosopher, Socrates, who was charged with corrupting the youth and impiety, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Let's go to the text. The Apology by Plato is one of the great works in Western literature. And I say in part that it's literature because it is Plato's reconstruction of Socrates' defense speech at his trial in 399. Socrates preferred to do all of his philosophizing by thinking and in conversation. He never actually wrote anything down. So what we have then is his most brilliant student, Plato, after Socrates' trial is over and probably after his death has occurred, reconstructing, likely very accurately, the main lines of argument. So it is important then to say that this is a work by Plato, but also the historical accuracy is likely to be very high. A little notice, you might notice as we're scrolling through here some numbers over toward the right margin. Those are called Stephanus numbers, and one of the early editions of Plato's works was by Stephanus, and so these are meant to indicate where in the Stephanus edition one can find it. So it's a standard way of indicating where one is in a Platonic text so that people using different translations and editions can nonetheless be on the same page, so to speak. So if after this you do go and read the Apology for yourself, I recommend that you do, particularly if there are passages that strike one's fancy, one can more easily find those by referencing the Stephanus numbers. All right, what has happened is that this trial is partway through when Plato picks up Socrates. Socrates is now about to give his defense speech. The prosecution has already presented its case, it has rested, and now the defense is about to speak, and Socrates will speak on his own behalf. The context is that it's a democratically conducted trial. Citizens may participate in the juror, and then there are various other constituency of the city of Athens represented there. But we think there is 500, more likely 501 jurors at his trial. So this is a trial by one's peers, as is in keeping with democratic traditions. So here is Socrates now speaking on his own behalf. "How you have felt, O men of Athens, after hearing the speeches of my accusers, I cannot tell. But I know that their persuasive words almost made me forget who I was. Such was the effect of them." And this is interesting. Plato is having Socrates start, most likely accurately, with a word of praise for his accusers. We all know we're in the midst of an argument, big stakes and so on. It's very easy immediately to go on to the attack. But in this case, Socrates has the presence of mind to recognize when a good speech has been made, that it was a good speech. And so in part giving credit where credit is due, but also indicating something of his own character. He is able to recognize good speeches for what they are. He's not going to be a hothead and so forth. And yet, they have hardly spoken a word of truth. Now, interesting also about the rhetoric here is that Socrates is speaking initially not about the content, but the rhetorical framing. And one of the points he then first mentions is that they, that is to say his accusers, told the jurors to be on their guard about Socrates as this master rhetorician, this perhaps sneaky orator who's likely to pull some verbal trickery, and so they should be on their guard for him. So he's very attentive to those sorts of issues. They told you to be upon your guard and not let yourselves be deceived by the force of my eloquence. And so what he wants them to do is to take up his reputation for being a very good speaker and perhaps even for being a tricky, sneaky kind of speaker. And so he needs to diffuse this, and he spends much of the early part of the trial speaking about his general reputation in Athens. So many people like him, but he knows he has a lot of enemies out there, and so he needs somehow to address the preconceptions that many of the 501 jurors will have been bringing into the trial. It's interesting that one of the points he makes and emphasizes in these opening remarks is his age. He says, "For I am more than 70 years of age, and this is the first time that I have ever appeared in a court of law." And there's at least two things going on here. One thing, of course, is to say, here I am, I'm an old man. And it's fairly common in trials such as this for people to appeal to their youth, to their age, go easy on me because I'm an old man. But I think the more important thing that's going on here is the second part. He says, this is the first time I've ever appeared in a court of law. I think we, and as the readers and certainly the jurors, are meant to reflect for a moment how in a democratic society where there's lots of lawsuits going on and people suing each other for all over the case and all sorts of trials being conducted on a regular basis. So it's a very argue-y kind of judicial system, as we know is characteristic of democratic societies. How does someone get to 70 years of age and never before appear in a court of law? The implication is that he has conducted himself honorably, decently, and hasn't broken various laws. He's not been the kind of person who other people have felt the need to sue on a regular basis, and so that speaks something to his character. But then also, he's also not the kind of person who sues other people at the drop of a hat for light reasons and so on. So that, I think, is planting a seed in the juror's mind. Instead, don't worry about all of those rhetorical issues. Think only of the justice of my cause. And of course, this is a law court. Law courts are supposed to be about justice. And so Socrates wants to remind us that that is the only thing, the fundamental thing that matters. Justice. I've had many accusers. He mentions one of the ones who is formally bringing the lawsuit here. Anytus, Meletus, whom we will encounter a little bit later, and Lycon were the other two. So the formal charges were brought by three, and he's going to take up those formal charges. But first he spends a great deal of time talking about his more difficult accusers, that is to say, those who have preconceptions about him. And in many cases, those preconceptions will be biases, and things are out there in the society, and rumors spread, and rumors are planted by people who have personal enemies and grudges and so forth. And it's very hard to speak to those sorts of accusations because they are not said to your face, and they are out there, and you don't know exactly who does so. Far more dangerous are these who began when you were children and took possession of your minds with their falsehoods, telling of one Socrates, a wise man who speculated about the heavens above and searched into the earth beneath and made the worse appear the better cause. So that then is to say that Socrates has a somewhat unsavory reputation in the minds of many people. Of course, he's doing all of these weird philosophy things, all right, and so forth, but also that he has this sneaky trick of taking really bad arguments and making them seem like those are the better arguments, and taking what are really good arguments and undermining them, perhaps again in sneaky ways. So one of the groups of people Socrates is sometimes associated with is a group of people who are called the Sophists. And these are paid teachers of rhetoric, and they would be very good at rhetoric. And in a commercial and democratic society such as Athens, one needs to be able to speak well. And so professional teachers of rhetoric such as the Sophists could make a pretty good living teaching young people who had some ambitions. But philosophically, the Sophists also had a well-deserved reputation for being very skeptical, very relativistic, very subjectivistic, and somewhat unsavory in their application of their arguments, that what they taught because it doesn't really matter what the truth is, what the justice is, what the just result is, but rather the important thing is winning. Winning in the court of law, winning in the negotiation, and doing whatever you need to do rhetorically to do so. And so Socrates is sometimes, in the minds of many people, lumped in with the sophists. And this is one thing that he's very concerned to counter. He is not a sophist in either of those sense. He'll make the point he's never charged money, and he does not believe skeptically and relativistically and just in terms of power politics the way the sophists do. He also, though, makes a point of mentioning Aristophanes, right? A certain comic poet, and Aristophanes really is great. He's a comic genius, brilliant, and we do have to imagine that most of the people in Athens who loved the plays, loved theater, the way we would go to movies and watch all sorts of shows on television, just consume huge amounts of it. And Aristophanes was brilliant, that most of them would have seen many of the plays by Aristophanes. And in one of those plays, Aristophanes goes after a character called Socrates. Aristophanes often would just lampoon famous people of his time, and Socrates was one of those people, but he would ridicule them by making them into buffoons, putting all sorts of views into their mouths that they didn't actually espouse, and so forth. And so the character Socrates, as portrayed by Aristophanes, really is a kind of ridiculous philosopher. He is a paid sophist. He's kind of argumentative. He does, in fact, corrupt many of his students. He seems quite sacrilegious and impious with respect to anything that anyone might hold sacred. And so for the thousands of people who saw Aristophanes' play about this character called Socrates, they kind of know that this is a comic portrayal, but nonetheless, much of that is going to stick with them, and they're going to think that the real Socrates, whom they have never met, is probably something like that. So Socrates has some serious problems. But in addition to the Aristophanes group, in addition to the sophists, who he does mention by name group here, there is a more dangerous group, and these are the people who are not comic poets. They're not worried that Socrates really is a sophist, but nonetheless, they do disagree with Socrates' methods of teaching young people. They do believe that he plays sometimes fast and loose with traditional religion, and on behalf of those beliefs, they are very traditional. They are more conservative in their orientation. They think Socrates is a danger. So this fame, he does have some fame. He does recognize it. Where does this fame come from? All of this great fame and talk about you would never have arisen if you have been like other men. So he recognizes he's not like other men. Now, where does his reputation come from? I mean, comic poets don't write plays about you unless you are pretty famous. People don't accuse you of being in league with the most famous sophists of the day unless you've got a great reputation yourself for rhetorical skill. And so Socrates wants then to suggest another story about what his reputation really is based upon. Okay, so he's going to call a witness, sort of. Next, I will refer you to a witness who is worthy of credit and who will tell you about my wisdom. That witness shall be the god of Delphi, and this is Apollo, who speaks through an oracle, a priestess at the temple at Delphi. And people can go on a kind of pilgrimage to Delphi, make a request at the oracle, give them some advice or give them some words of wisdom about something that is on their mind. And so Socrates mentions here a friend of his, Chaerephon, right, who went to the oracle at Delphi and was basically asking the oracle, is Socrates in fact the smartest guy around? Is he the wisest person ever? Is he a genius? I think there's something to him, but I'm not myself, Chaerephon, a philosophical genius. Let me know what I should really think about Socrates. So Chaerephon went to the oracle and boldly asked the oracle whether there was anyone wiser than I was. And the prophetess answered that, and pay attention to the formulation here, there was no man wiser than Socrates. So what does this mean? There is no man wiser than Socrates. Now, the standard immediate thing is then to say, oh, well, so the god is saying through the oracle, the priestess, well, Socrates is the wisest man in Athens. Now, Socrates is aware of that kind of interpretation, but what's interesting about most of the oracles that come from the priestess at Delphi is that they are ambiguous and can be interpreted in at least two different ways. And often there's an easy interpretation, an obvious interpretation. Usually that's not the correct interpretation. So you have to be on your guard. You have to spend a little bit of effort thinking how it might otherwise be interpreted, and then make, of course, your best judgment about which of the interpretations is appropriate. And so that's exactly what we see Socrates doing in the next paragraph. When I heard the answer, I said to myself, what can the god mean? And what is the interpretation of this riddle? For I know that I have no wisdom. So Socrates then is saying that he does not believe he is in the possession of wisdom. He's dedicated his life to seeking wisdom. Philosophy is literally the love of wisdom, and to be a philosopher is to be a lover of wisdom and to make that your quest in life. To answer the big question, what is truth? What is justice? What is piety? What is it really to be courageous? One is seeking wisdom in all of these important areas of human life. And Socrates does not think that he has been successful in this mission. These issues are difficult, and as a result, he's not sure that he has the best or even the right or even the best answers to these questions. I have no wisdom, small or great, so how can it possibly be that I am the wisest man in Athens, particularly Athens, which has a great and deserved reputation for having accomplished people in all sorts of disciplines and walks of life. But I can't just dismiss what the god has said, yet he is a god and cannot lie. So when the oracle says, no one is wiser than Socrates, that has to be a truth. But it can't be that Socrates is wiser than other people, because that would imply that Socrates has some wisdom, and Socrates does not believe that he has some wisdom. So what is the oracle saying, and what is she implying for Socrates? So Socrates says this is how he decided to interpret this. I reflected that if I could only find a man wiser than myself, then I might go to the god with a refutation in my hand. I should say to him, here's a man who is wiser than I am, but you said that I was the wisest. And so Socrates then says, what I have then is a mission based on what the god has said, to go out and find a wise man. Accordingly, I went to one who had the reputation of wisdom and observed to him. His name I need not mention. He was a politician. Of course, politicians always say, we have all of the answers, give us power, we will solve all your problems, and so on. So we go to here a politician. And the result was as follows. When I began to talk with him, I could not help thinking that he was not really wise. Although he was thought wise by many, and wiser still by himself, and I went and I tried to explain to him that he thought himself wise, but was not really wise. So this guy believes certain things. Socrates raises some challenging questions for this. Well, what about this countervailing opinion? And pretty soon the guy doesn't really know what he's talking about. And it's kind of clear to the politician himself, as well as to Socrates, and of course to anybody who's listening in on these conversations over dinner, at a party, in the marketplace, right, wherever. This guy, Socrates, has just run circles around him. He's a blowhard, or perhaps he doesn't know nearly as much as he thinks he does. So this guy is not really wise. That's the conclusion. But how do people react when you puncture their pretensions, when you undermine their important beliefs on matters of politics, when you undercut their reputation publicly, or at least semi-publicly, for being a great and wise people? They do not like you, right? And then Socrates notices this. The consequence was that he hated me, and his enmity was shared by several who were present and heard me. So I'm looking for wisdom. I hear Socrates. I do what young people, or genuine seekers of wisdom do. You find people who have a reputation for wisdom and see what you can learn from them. If it turns out they don't know what they're talking about, well, you've learned something. Unfortunately, that negative conclusion is not going to endear you to that person. You're more likely to make an enemy. That is to say, the politician wants a reputation for wisdom, but he's not actually concerned with wisdom. And of course, we can recognize that kind of politician. Socrates says, well, I didn't stop there. Then I went to another who had still higher philosophical pretensions, and my conclusions was exactly the same. I made another enemy of him and many others besides. So this is where his reputation is really coming from, and why so many people think badly of him and now want to attack him to the point of bringing a lawsuit. I swear to you, Athenians, by the dog I swear. Come back in a moment to the by the dog. I found that the men most in repute were all but the most foolish. Right? And it wasn't just the politicians. As we scrolled down, I went to the poets. The poets claimed to be articulating important truths about the human condition. I went to the manual artisans. I had conversations with famous rhetoricians and so on. And the general conclusion is I found that the men who had most reputation for being wise were not in fact wise at all. And this is, of course, quite distressing, particularly in an accomplished nation like Athens. We want to keep Athens great. We want to keep Athens strong. We need to have people in positions of leadership in all of the major walks of life who, in fact, know the truth, know what is honorable, know what courage requires, being able to exercise good judgment on all sorts of matters, commercial, political, foreign policy, legal matters, religious matters, and so on. And Socrates is not finding these people. Now, one of the formal charges we know is that Socrates is impious. And of course, many of his conversations are going to be with people who have strong views on religion. But how good are their views on religion? And if in fact it turns out they don't have very well articulated views on religion, also those people are going to find Socrates' questions and his challenges and his alternatives very unsettling, and they are likely to become his enemies too. Socrates is going to become seen from their perspective rather to be a kind of enemy of religion, not to be believing in the traditional religions. Now, I'm making some heavy weather about this at this point. I want to go back to this formulation of by the dog, which is just slipped in here, because the dog here who is being referred to is, there is no dog god in the Greek pantheon whom one would swear to. Instead, this is likely a reference to one of the Greek gods, kind of a half dog, half human. And so what we then have is Socrates swearing. Perhaps this is just an epithet, but nonetheless, it is in a court of law and everybody is paying attention. And here we have Socrates swearing by some foreign god. And the implication then would be that perhaps he's not true and fast only to the Greek gods. And so a little interesting rhetorical point. So I've made a lot of enemies, but I've surveyed the ground. And so Socrates then is in a position to reach a conclusion about what the oracle meant. The truth is, O men of Athens, that God only is wise, and in this oracle he means to say that the wisdom of men is little or nothing. He, O men, is the wisest who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. So Socrates then can say, in a way, I am the wisest person in Athens, even though I know I have no wisdom. And my wisdom is going to be of a negative kind. I don't believe, falsely, like so many do, that I'm such a wise guy, that I've got all sorts of things figured out. That is a pretense of wisdom or a self-deception with respect to wisdom, and I have not fallen into that trap. I know accurately that I have no wisdom, and in that accurate judgment, I am wiser than all of those who falsely believe that they do have positive wisdom. So that's how he interprets the oracle, but notice also that he is saying, and given in the context that one of the charges is that he is impious, that he is doing what he is doing in large part because of what the oracle has said, that he's interpreting this as a kind of divine mission to find wisdom, to find wise people, to find out what people really want or don't want. So in response to the charge of impiety, he's laying the groundwork for undercutting that impiety charge. I go my way, obedient to the God, and this is what I dedicate my life to as Socrates, make inquisition into the wisdom of anyone, whether citizen or stranger, who appears to be wise. And if he is not wise, then in vindication of the oracle, I show him that he is not wise. And this occupation quite absorbs me, and I have no time to give either to any public matter of interest or to any concern of my own, but I am in utter poverty by reason of my devotion to the God. And I mentioned here again of his poverty. He's not making money as a result of this. That means he's not a sophist. The sophists are ones who charge for it. And then he goes on to draw a big intermediate conclusion. This is the reason why my three accusers, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, have set upon me. Meletus, who has a quarrel with me on behalf of the poets, Anytus on behalf of the craftsmen, Lycon on behalf of the rhetoricians. Okay, so this informal, widespread public reputation he has really is based on a series of falsehoods, and the factions that have come together, represented by these three individuals, are driven by wounded pride and not wanting to have a troublemaker like Socrates continuing to puncture their pretensions to wisdom, to undermine their reputations and all of the social goodies that come from having a good reputation. What's really going on here is his enemies want to get rid of a troublemaker. It's not about the truth of the charges, it's not about justice, it's about getting rid of one's enemies and using the courts to get rid of one's enemies. But there are formal charges, and Socrates does want to take up the charges in formal fashion and deal with them explicitly. And the charges are two. They must have their affidavit read. What do they say? Something of this sort, that Socrates is a doer of evil, and there are two evils. He's a corrupter of the youth, and he does not believe in the gods of the state, and has other new divinities of his own. So one is then to say in general terms, he is corrupting the youth. Lots of ambitious young people are attracted to Socrates. He spends a lot of time with them. He teaches them philosophy and all sorts of other matters. And the charge is that the lessons that Socrates is giving to them are corrupting them, making the youth bad, thereby undercutting the future of Athens. And then the related charge is that he is not pious. He does not believe in the gods of the city, but rather has some other gods or other divinities that he believes in as well. And of course, those charges can be related. That one of the ways in which Socrates is corrupting the youth is by teaching them false religion. So his manner changes at this point, his manner of proceeding rather. He turns to cross-examining his prosecutor, Meletus, who was the main spokesman for the prosecution. And this is a very interesting strategy and set of tactics within a strategy that Socrates uses here. So let's spend a little bit of time seeing how this cross-examining goes. Come hither, Meletus, let me ask a question of you. You think a great deal about the improvement of the youth. Yes, I do, Meletus answers. And so Socrates then asks him, well, tell the judges then, who is their improver? For you must know, as you have taken the pains to discover their corrupter and are citing and accusing me before them. Speak then and tell the judges who their improver is. Now, interestingly, there must be a pause, and Meletus does not answer Socrates' question here, and Socrates points this out. Observe, Meletus, that you are silent and have nothing to say. And this is interesting because what could Meletus do? There's 501 jurors plus various other people in attendance. If Meletus were to say, well, out of these 500 people, I'm going to point out these people. Those are the people who know how to improve the youth. Well, that's perhaps not the best strategy at this point, because if he points out these 5 people, then of course the other hundreds are going to say, well, what about me? Why didn't Meletus point me out? And then they're less likely to vote for Meletus's side in this case. And of course, Socrates realizes what he is doing, and he pushes Meletus. Now, I want you to point out the people who, in fact, know how properly to educate the youth, and by contrast, that I am someone who is miseducating the youth. So tell me, all right, you're under oath. You have to say something here. And so Meletus says, well, the laws. Okay. Socrates, but my good sir, that is not my meaning. I want to know who the person is, who in the first place knows the laws. And so Meletus then says safely, well, the judges, Socrates, who are present in court. What do you mean, Meletus, that they are able to instruct and improve the earth? Certainly they are. Well, all of the judges or some only? Well, no, we know, of course, what Meletus has to answer. He says, well, some of the judges do and some of them don't. That would not be politic in the court of laws. He would make some enemies. So he says all of them are basically good at educating the youth. By the goddess, Socrates replies, Here, that is some good news. There are plenty of improvers then. And what do you say then of the audience? What about all of these other people over here? Do they improve them? Yes, they do, Meletus answers. And the senators? Yes, the senators improve them. But perhaps the members of the citizen assembly corrupt them? Or do they too improve them? Well, they improve them. Then, this is Socrates now, the trap has been sprung, pointing it out. Then every Athenian improves and elevates them, all with the exception of myself, and I alone am their corrupter. Is that what you affirm? That is what I stoutly affirm, Meletus replies. Okay. Now, this is the trap, and Meletus has fallen into it. Obviously, he is engaged in an overstatement, and a huge overstatement. If Meletus then wants to say, basically, everybody in Athens is really good at educating, and the only person in all of Athens who is bad at educating and is corrupting the youth is Socrates. Now, who's actually going to believe that? And the point, I think, is going to be that everyone will recognize that Meletus has made a wild overstatement. But why is he making this wild overstatement? Well, obviously because he wants to make everybody who is there vote for him. He doesn't want to make any enemies. But that then means that Meletus is really only concerned with winning the trial, and that he's willing to suck up to everybody in order to win the trial. He's not at all interested in the truth. Anybody who's going to make a wild overstatement in a court of law is not interested in the truth, is not interested in justice. Something else must be going on. And Socrates goes on to elaborate the point a little bit by using an analogy of a horse trainer. I mean, suppose you had a horse that mattered a lot to you, and you wanted to hire someone to train your horse. Well, you just wouldn't go out into the streets of Athens and randomly pick any stranger and assume, they're all really good at training horses, and so it doesn't really matter whom I choose. Instead, the opposite seems to be the case. It's not that everybody knows how to train horses. Some people have expertise, and you would exercise good judgment in hiring that one or few people who have the expertise. Now, when we start talking about human beings and not horses, of course, it's going to be exactly the same. Not everybody knows how to train human beings very well. There are lots of bad teachers, bad parents, and so forth who are out there. In fact, it's probably a minority of people who have the relevant expertise. So, Meletus is obviously not interested in truth, not interested in justice. Score 1 point at least for Socrates. Now, then we turn to the other charge, this issue of impiety and Socrates' religious beliefs. Now, carrying on the cross-examination of Meletus. I should like to know, Meletus, in what I am affirmed to corrupt the youth. I suppose you I suppose you mean, as I infer from your indictment, that I teach them not to acknowledge the gods which the state acknowledges, but some other new divinities or spiritual agencies in their stead. Meletus answers, yes, that I say emphatically. Well, I don't quite understand yet whether, Socrates is replying here, you affirm that I teach others to acknowledge some gods, and therefore do believe in gods, and I'm not an entire atheist. So I do believe in some gods, but maybe just some different gods. Or are you saying that I am an atheist simply and a teacher of atheism? I mean the latter, Meletus replies, that you are a complete atheist. And again, Meletus has fallen into a trap. That's an extraordinary statement, Meletus. Now, he does make mention here of Anaxagoras. This is Socrates, an earlier philosopher and natural scientist who had also been charged with impiety. He had been one of the first, and perhaps the first, to hypothesize that the sun was not a god, but rather much further away in the sky, and it was in fact a giant rock larger than the Peloponnese, the largest island in the Greek area, larger than the Peloponnese, really far away, and just burning right up there in the sky. So not a god, but rather a natural phenomenon. For that and other things, Anaxagoras was charged with impiety and eventually had to go into exile. And so are you saying that I'm like Anaxagoras and I don't really believe in any gods as well? And once again, Meletus says, I swear by Zeus that you believe absolutely in none at all. And Socrates is then able to say quite accurately, you are a liar, Meletus, not even believed by yourself. Just in the space of 1 minute, you have contradicted yourself. And Socrates goes on to point out the contradiction. When we look at the formal charge is that Socrates teaches novel gods and novel divinities. Different, some of the gods that he apparently believes in are not the traditional gods of Athens. But that then is to say he is a theist and not an atheist. He just believes in the wrong gods. But then Socrates then has him affirm, yes, that's exactly what I mean. But then he kind of dangles some bait. Meletus, you could say that I don't really believe in any gods at all. You could say that I'm an atheist. And then people would really, really hate me for being a complete and total atheist. And Meletus says, oh, great, yes, you are an atheist. I'm going to charge you with being an atheist. And that then is to say, in the space of just a few sentences, he's contradicted himself. Now, what kind of person is going to contradict himself in such a serious venue? It's going to be someone who has not really thought through the indictment, just wants to put something out there that will be damaging to his enemy. And when he has the chance to say something that is even more apparently damaging to the enemy, will go ahead and say so in the heat of the moment. Truth does not matter to Meletus. And the justice and accuracy of the charge does not matter to Meletus. Score another point for Socrates against Meletus. Now, I don't have to say a whole lot more. Socrates says, clearly, I think I've shown these charges are not well grounded, that Meletus is a personal enemy, and that it's a large amount of envy and detraction from the world. That's really what's going on. And so therefore the formal charges can be dismissed. I have said enough in answer to the charges of Meletus. Let us move on. Now another point Socrates then turns to is this issue about, well, okay, you're a smart guy, Socrates, and you've made a lot of powerful enemies. Why do you have to be so pushy about this? Why can't we just agree that you'll tone things down a little bit? We'll work out a kind of compromise here. Maybe it's not so much that we really believe that you are corrupting people and you're impious and so on, but you're such a jerk about it, right? Or you're just too in people's face about it. So why don't we say, maybe some of the discussions before the trial actually occurred, we will let bygones be bygones, we'll drop the charges, and you'll agree to tone things down and just basically shut up about things for a while. Socrates then wants to say he's not going to take this compromise, right? And that given his philosophical lights, he cannot compromise. Someone will say, "Are you not ashamed, Socrates, of a course of life which is likely to bring you to an untimely end?" So here you're going around making all sorts of enemies among very powerful people and connected powerful people. So you're just setting yourself up for death. You're running the risk of being killed. And of course, that's exactly what's going on in this trial here. So one of the possible penalties is the penalty of death. And here Socrates, in addition to raising this issue of piety, I'm following the oracle, this issue of justice, what are the actual truths of the charges, and Meletus is not actually concerned with justice here. This issue of courage, which is another important virtue near and dear to the hearts of the Athenians. Men need to fight the important battles, to stand up to their enemies, and always be willing to fight for the truth, fight for the justice, even against powerful enemies and overwhelming odds. Socrates reminds his audience of this. A man who is good for anything ought not to calculate the chance of living or dying. He ought only to consider whether in doing anything he is doing right or wrong. Whereas according to your view, right, and then he gives some military examples here, the heroes who fell at Troy were not good for much. The son of Thetis, that's Achilles, who had his famous battle with Hector in order to defend his slain companion Patroclus. So think about all of the great heroes in a military context. Of course, all of them are afraid. They recognize that they are running great risks. They have powerful enemies who could kill them. In that context, how do we want our men to act? Well, we want them to act like manly men, to be courageous and to fight the battle even though they recognize that they can be killed. And philosophy, and the philosopher's point that Socrates is making here is that philosophy is a kind of battle, but it's an important battle. We're fighting for virtue, for truth, and for the souls of human beings, and wanting them to be the best that they possibly can be. And those all have enemies, of course, but what we want is for philosophers to be courageous, just as people in the military are courageous in fighting their two different but deeply allied battles. Strange indeed would be my conduct of men of Athens, when I was ordered by the generals whom you chose to command me at Potidaea and at Amphipolis and at Delium, remained where they placed me like any other man facing death. And so what he is then saying is, I have done my military service, and courage is required in military service. And in all of these cases, when the generals ordered me into battle, I did my military service. I fought with the best of my fellow Athenians. I'm a courageous guy in physical battles and the same thing in intellectual battles. If I say now, when, as I conceive it, God orders me to fulfill the philosopher's mission of searching into myself and other men, I were to desert my post through fear of death. We don't want cowardly philosophers. We want philosophers who are courageous, who will do what the gods order them, in this case the oracle as interpreted by Socrates, to go out and do philosophy to the best of one's ability. I can't compromise on that. I need to be courageous. I need to be a man of integrity. So Socrates then goes on to say, I can't compromise on this. So the deal that was likely offered to Socrates before the trial and might even be offered officially during the trial now, back off from doing your philosophy and we'll drop the charges. Socrates says, no deal. If you say to me, Socrates, this time we will not mind Anytus, and we will let you off, but upon one condition, that you are to inquire and speculate in this way anymore, and that if you are caught doing this again, you shall die. If this was the condition on which you let me go, I should reply, men of Athens, I honor and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone with whom I meet after my manner, and convincing him, saying, and here is the important lesson, O my friend, why do you who are a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens care so much about laying up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation, and so little about wisdom and truth and the greatest improvement of the soul? And he wants to then go on to say, it's not that there's anything wrong with money and honor and reputation, but the precondition of all of those is the state of your soul, your character, your virtue. And he goes on to make that point explicit. For this is the command of God, as I would have you know, and I believe that to this day no greater good has ever happened in the state than my service to the God. Now this is an interesting point I was going to pause on here. He's saying two things closely related. One is the most important thing is philosophy, because philosophy is about the most important thing. But also I, Socrates, am the person, the philosopher who has most dedicated himself to doing philosophy well, consistently, properly, without apology. And so therefore I am the most valuable person in all of Athenian history. And that's an interesting rhetorical point for Socrates to be emphasizing in this point, certainly a double-edged point. For I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought for your persons and your properties, but first and chiefly to care about the greatest improvement of the soul. I tell you that virtue is not given by money, but that from virtue come money and every other good of man, public as well as private. Character, virtue is the foundation. All of the goods, personally, all of the goods publicly, the greatness of Athens comes from the virtue of its citizenry. This is my teaching. And if this is the doctrine which corrupts the youth, my influence is ruinous indeed. A little bit sarcastic there. Of course, he doesn't think that that ruins the youth. He thinks that's the greatest possible improvement for the youth. Now, there's a danger here, and he gives a kind of warning. If you kill me, you will not easily find another like me. Right? Great philosophers, how many of them are there? And if you start killing off your great philosophers, you're not likely to incentivize more people to become great philosophy, to speak their minds and do the hard philosophical work. He wants to say, what you need is not to kill people off like me, but encourage more people like me. And he has this arresting analogy that he makes, that he is a kind of gadfly, and that the city of Athens or the state of Athens is like a big horse, a great and noble steed, as he puts it. But the gadfly is sometimes irritating, and when the steed is too complacent, and gadflies do find it easy to bite horses when they're not moving at all, give it a little bite, and that spurs the steed to action and reaction. So, if you kill me, you will not easily find another like me, who, if I may use such a ludicrous figure of speech, am a sort of gadfly given to the state by the god. And the state is like a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size, and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has given to the state, and all day long and in all places am always fastening upon you, arousing, persuading, and reproaching you. So we want gadflies. We want people to raise the hard question, to not let us rest with easy answers, always to be challenging us, to be contradicting us, to improving us, to be correcting us. It's unpleasant, yes, that's fine, but a person of strong character who is really concerned with what is the best will welcome the criticism. Socrates knows he's a pain in the butt. He is a gadfly, but that is a good and important function in a healthy society. And Socrates does want to say, once again, on this money issue, even his accusers who are suggesting that he is a sophist, have not brought any witnesses forward who is saying that in performing this important service for Athens, that he's just doing it for money. There are no witnesses to suggest that is what that is. All right, he wants to go on. He has some harsh things to say about politics, that people who are genuinely concerned with the truth and justice and goodness and have integrity, they don't last very long in politics. And so what you end up with in politics, and perhaps even especially in democratic politics, Socrates and Plato are both not great fans of democracy, is going to be the worst, maybe not the worst, but among the worst of the people who are possible. And he gives a couple of examples when he brushed up against politics. In both cases, he was pushed to corrupt himself, to do something that he knew was not just, or to engage in things that were based on falsehoods. And in both cases, he says he refused to engage in that, but based on those two earlier experiences, decided that a career in politics was not for him, that he would do his philosophy privately. And he gives two examples that would be well known to the Athenians who were there. They would be in living memory, where Socrates in both cases acted as a man of integrity. Don't forget who I am dealing with. He then goes on to say, look, if we really believe that I have been corrupting the youth, well, by the fruits shall ye know them. Consider the kind of people who, over the course of my life, I have attracted to me, who have come to be my students and then have become my friends and dear companions. And he goes on to list a large number of them who are well-regarded, accomplished individuals in Athens and people of good character, reputation. And there's a long list of them through this paragraph. So if I really have been this great corrupting person, why would I be attracting people of this quality to me? And so just their mere existence and the fact that they are proud to call themselves my friends and say that I was formerly their teacher, that is a huge point in my favor. And with that, Socrates brings his defense speech to an end. And to you and to God I commit my cause, to be determined by you as is best for you and me. And it's interesting, he thinks both he and Athens are on trial here. We'll see more about why that is later. 501 citizens cast their votes, and Socrates is found guilty. 281 to 230. As is common in Athenian trials, what happens next is once the person has been found innocent or guilty. Actually, if the person is found innocent, it's over. But if the person is found guilty, there's a discussion of what the penalty should be, and the prosecution and the defense both get to propose a penalty, which is then voted upon. The prosecution has proposed that Socrates be put to death, the death penalty for his charges, corrupting the youth and impiety. He's now to be considered guilty of those. And so now it is Socrates' turn to propose what penalty he thinks is going to be appropriate. He does make an interesting point early on that he says he's surprised at how close the vote was. He says, it really was only 30 votes difference. That's about 6%. And so if only 6% of people had voted the other way, he would have been found innocent. And it's interesting that Socrates did not think that the vote was going to be so close. He thought he would be found guilty by a much larger margin. He mentions that Meletus, on behalf of the formal accusers, have proposed death as the penalty. And then there's a fascinating passage here where Socrates makes a suggestion, and he makes it seriously, that really he should not be being penalized. He says, look, I don't think I am a bad guy here. I don't think that I am guilty of this charge. In fact, I do think I have done wonderful and important things for the city of Athens. And so what do I really deserve? Reflecting that I was really too honest a man to follow in this way and live, that is to say, various compromises. I did not go about where I could do no good to you or to myself, But where I could do the greatest good privately to every one of you, thither I went and sought to persuade every man among you that he much look to himself and seek virtue and wisdom. Well, what does such a man deserve? What shall be done to such a one? Doubtless some good thing. You should be rewarding me, not punishing me. And so he makes the suggestion here, there can be no more fitting reward than maintenance in the Prytaneum. Now, the Prytaneum is a place of honor where people who are being honored by the city basically can get free meals and care at the Prytaneum. Olympic athletes who have won, people who have performed various noble deeds and so forth. And so Socrates says that's really what you should be doing with someone like me. But he knows that that's not going to fly, and he knows, of course, there's going to be a lot of hubbub from the people present. Well, how dare he say, is he mocking us? The issue is what the penalty should be, and now he's suggesting that we should be rewarding him. What a jerk, and so on. Well, then he runs through a bunch of other possible punishments. Should I be imprisoned? Well, why should I go to prison? Should I pay a penalty of a fine? He says, well, I'm a poor guy. I don't have any money to pay the fine. Should I go into exile? Well, I'm 70 years old. I don't move around so easily anymore. I don't really want to go into exile. And then some of his friends who are quite prosperous then are basically suggesting to him, Socrates, propose a fine. We'll put up 30 minae, which is a considerable amount of money. Plato, Crito, Critobulus, Apollodorus, and so on. We'll put the money up. And so Socrates says, okay, fine. We'll propose a fine, 30 minae. Let that be the penalty. My friends are good for it. So then we have a vote on what the penalty should be. Should it be the 30 minae fine? Should it be the death penalty? And the jury votes for death. Now, a very, very interesting point. If you notice the numbers here, 360 people voted for the death penalty, and only 141 voted for the fine. And what's fascinating about that is that the number of people who voted for the death penalty is significantly larger than the number of people who voted for guilty. And what that then means is that over the course of however long Socrates' discussion was about what the penalty should be, however long the prosecution's proposal for what the penalty should be, 10, 15, 20 minutes or so, over the course of 20 minutes, 80 people who voted that Socrates should be found innocent have now decided that he should be put to death. And what does this mean for the conduct of trials by jury in a democratic state? Now, Socrates does not make a big deal about this, but it is worth thinking about, and I certainly know that Plato, who is no friend of democracy, wants us to think about this. Trials are supposed to be about the truth, finding the truth, and then acting justly with respect to the truth. We clearly have a large number of people who are not at all interested in philosophy, or certainly in Socrates' approach to philosophy, who want to get rid of this guy, who want him to be found guilty and punished. And democracies are going to be constituted by large numbers of such people. What kind of policies, though, are we going to get if in a democracy that kind of person has political power? The results are not going to be very pretty. And when we come to a court of law, where a man's life is in the balance, right? Clearly, Socrates alienated a certain number of people, but what kind of people couldn't have made up their own mind and say, no, I think this guy is not guilty, and so if I have to vote for a penalty, I'm going to go for the lesser penalty. But they're so offended, right, or irritated by whatever Socrates has said that they let their emotions dominate them to the point where they are voting for death. The kind of person who, in an emotionalist way, can vote for the death of someone whom just a few minutes earlier thought should be set free. What kind of society are we going to have if we have lots of those sorts of people conducting justice in trials and doing democracy? It's an important political implication for us to think through. Now, what is then customary after the sentence has been passed is for the now condemned man to say some final words. on his own behalf. And Socrates has some very interesting things about death and whether death is something to fear. Is death like a long sleep, in which case it's not really something to fear, or is it a matter of going to another place where you are reunited with your family and friends and all of the great heroes of old, which doesn't sound too bad. But I won't at this point spend time on those, because Socrates does, in a subsequent dialogue, the Phaedo, his actual execution scene, have some things to say about death and his philosophical reaction there. But what is interesting, and the point I want to conclude this with, is Socrates does make some predictions for Athens, given what Athens has decided in his particular case. He knows he's going to die, and so there is the personal implication for him. That's going to have some effect on his friends, some implications for his family. But Socrates loves Athens, and he has some words of warning here. "And I prophesy to you who are my murderers, that immediately after my death, punishment far heavier than you have inflicted on me will surely await you." And the point seems to be that any society that does not welcome philosophers, as irritating as they can be sometimes, as challenging as they can be, as much as they are pushing us and prodding us to do this very hard, sometimes frustrating work, if we do not welcome philosophers, prize philosophers, and have large numbers of people engaging in philosophy, we cannot have a healthy society. Athens has achieved greatness, but it seems to be turning a corner and going in a different direction. We know it is becoming increasingly inhospitable to its philosophers. What happened to Anaxagoras? Now it's killing Socrates, and we can't be anachronistic here, but the trend does continue in the next generations. No society can be great if it says to the people doing the most important work, if you say things that we don't like, we will kill you. That is a recipe for decline. So, wherefore, O judges, be of good cheer about death, and know this of a truth. No evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death. And final remark, the hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die, and you to live, which is better, God only knows.